Dinuba Presbyterian Church, and welcome back to our online video Bible study. We are starting a new series this week of studies looking at some beloved Christmas carols, looking at their origins and their backgrounds, and seeing how they can illuminate the story of Jesus' advent that we read about in the scriptures that happened 2,000 years ago. If you're anything like me, you're probably shocked that it's already Christmas time. I can't believe that we have gotten to Advent already. For churches that follow a liturgical calendar and that are very liturgically minded, Advent is actually the beginning of the liturgical year. So not only do we get to say Merry Christmas already, we can already say Happy New Year. The beginning of a new year can bring a lot of joy and a lot of excitement for the year ahead. It can feel refreshing and newly energizing, but it can also feel forbidding and overwhelming when the year we have just left behind has been difficult or full of sorrow. The season of Advent confronts those feelings of sadness and distress that we all can feel over the holidays, and presents us with an unparalleled joy and hope for the future. God's gift of his son, Jesus, who came to Bethlehem 2,000 years ago and who is coming back again very soon. This collision of hope and fear in the Advent season has given rise to many wonderful hymns and carols celebrating this season and the story of Jesus' birth. And this week, we're going to begin by looking at a poem and a carol that's not usually in the Christmas top 40, if you will, but it can open a window into the depth of this gift of Jesus that we have received and the hope that comes along with it. So this week we are looking at the poem behind the Christmas carol we know as I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day. Recent years and new schools of poetic criticism have not been kind to the American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and his work has fallen into some disuse in the last few decades as his interest in Native American history and the Native American experience with European settlers arriving in the New World has been viewed with some new suspicion. It's rare to see or hear his Song of Hiawatha these days, and chances are that most of us are really only familiar with Longfellow's work because of his poem Paul Revere's Ride, which so famously captured that hasty journey of an American revolutionary to warn the colonists that the British were coming, and which still has a place in some history curricula. But these days, we probably interact with Longfellow's work the most at Christmas time through a carol that arose from a poem he wrote called Christmas Bells. It's an unremarkable title, perhaps, for a work born out of great personal tragedy and rekindled hope. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was born just 24 years after the end of the Revolutionary War in 1807 in the city of Portland, and at this time Portland, which is now in Maine, was a part of Massachusetts. Perhaps as a strange portent of what was to come in Longfellow's own life, his mother Zilpah named him after her brother, who had been killed in action while serving with the United States Navy at the Second Battle of Tripoli Harbor in 1804. It was a heroic and costly battle, and one that signaled to an aristocratic European admiralty that the U.S. Navy was a capable force to be reckoned with. It was kind of the calling card for this new nation of America. But the loss of her brother in that battle really grieved Zilpah very deeply, and she memorialized him in the name of her second son, Henry. The young Henry was a bright and gifted student, and as so many bright and gifted students do, Longfellow struggled with his parents over what his chosen profession would be. Unlike his namesake, he had no taste for military service. He was not interested in it. Henry's father was an educated, Harvard-trained lawyer, and unsurprisingly, he wanted his son to pursue a career in law as well. But Henry had another idea. He wanted to become a writer. America was, again, in its infancy as a nation, and its new constitution had only been in effect for 16 years. The pressures of building a nation from scratch after a long and difficult war for independence had left the United States without a whole lot of time or energy to create its own artistic circles or its own renowned men of letters. The United States, with its self-determining government, was a new culture on the world scene, and though it was busily proving itself economically and militarily, it had no core literary identity of its own. At this point, there were no American poets of any renown. Longfellow wanted to change all of this and to pursue his dreams of writing, particularly poetry. And he wanted to prove that artistic ventures could be economically sound and allow him to make a living for himself pursuing his passion, which, as it turns out, is a very American idea. The path to literary fame still ran through the university system, and in 1825, the faculty of Bowdoin College pulled him aside at his graduation to offer him a job among them as a professor of modern languages. Though he bristled at the busy work and all the administrative stuff that comes along with teaching that doesn't really involve writing or lecturing, he did find time to continue sharpening his own skills as a poet. In 1831, he married a woman named Mary Potter. Not Harry Potter, Mary Potter. And together they set out for a tour of Europe to allow Longfellow to study literature and language overseas in preparation for taking a new position as the professor of modern languages at his father's alma mater of Harvard. During the trip, though, Mary suffered a miscarriage. Her health never recovered, and before they made it to the end of their European tour, Mary, his young wife, died. Longfellow was devastated. He returned to New England as a young widower and threw himself into his work. Years later, after courting a woman named Fanny Appleton for 6 years and suffering a rejected marriage proposal at least once, Fanny finally agreed to marry Longfellow, and they married in 1843. What followed was a season of great happiness for him and his family, as they began raising children. They had 6 children, in fact: Charles, Ernest, Francis, Alice, Edith, and Anne Allegra, which is a pretty great name if you're looking for a name to suggest for a child or a grandchild. But as Longfellow's happiness grew, the nation's hopes for unity and peace were failing. Longfellow was particularly grieved by the Civil War, which the nation was unstoppably marching towards over these next few years. Longfellow supported the abolition of slavery. His work was even printed by the New England Anti-Slavery Society. And when President Lincoln himself heard a poem Longfellow wrote just before South Carolina seceded from the Union, Lincoln was said to have been moved to tears by its beauty. But Longfellow was troubled by the violence of the war and the hundreds of thousands of those who were dying on its battlefields. He mourned the fact that the country was tearing itself apart, the country he had been working so desperately to give a literary culture and standing in the world. Personal tragedy was not done yet with Longfellow. A string of losses with the death of his father in 1849, his brother in 1850, and his mother in 1851 was followed a decade later by a gruesome accident in the family's home in Cambridge. In 1861, his beloved wife Fanny had snipped a lock of hair off the back of the heads of their 2 youngest daughters. She wanted to preserve the hair as a keepsake, and so she placed the hair in small envelopes and melted some sealing wax to help seal those envelopes shut. Some of the wax dropped from the candle onto her dress, and when a gust of wind blew through an open window and met that wax, her dress ignited in flames. To preserve the safety of the children who were near her, she ran into Longfellow's study where he was writing at the time, and he desperately tried to put out the fire that was consuming her. Both Fanny and Longfellow were severely burned, and the next morning, Fanny succumbed to her injuries and she died. Longfellow was severely burned as well and disfigured on his face, and had nerve damage in his face from the flames. So much so that he could no longer shave without experiencing great pain. The enormous white beard we see in photographs of Longfellow later in his life were grown to spare himself from pain and to hide the scars of the accident that had made him a widower for the 2nd time. Longfellow was stricken and depressed after having experienced so much loss, and yet there was one more blow still to come. Against his express wishes, Longfellow's oldest son, Charles, enlisted in the Federal Army, and went off to fight the Civil War. Illness caused him to miss the Battle of Gettysburg, but in late November of 1864, Charles was wounded in action in Virginia. The bullet had damaged his spine, and he was sent back to a hospital in Washington, D.C. in severe condition. At home on December 1st, as the country prepared to celebrate Christmas, Longfellow received the news about his son, and he left Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he lived, to go to the hospital in Washington to either bring Charles home or to say goodbye. Miraculously, Charles survived his injuries, and a week later he was back home with Longfellow. Longfellow's faith, like so many New Englanders of the time, was apparently deeply held, but also deeply private. But the long road of sorrow that he had walked led him back into his study on Christmas Day, 1864, just 3 weeks after bringing Charles back home from Washington. And there he wrote a poem he entitled simply Christmas Bells. It is a deeply personal work, and in it we glimpse not only the effect of the war on Longfellow and his complex and compounded grief, but we also witness a truly amazing hope. And here it is, the text of Longfellow's poem, Christmas Bells. I heard the bells on Christmas Day, their old familiar carols play, and wild and sweet the words repeat of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And thought how, as the day had come, the belfries of all Christendom had rolled along the unbroken song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Till ringing, singing on its way, the world revolved from night to day, a voice, a chime, a chant sublime of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Then from each black, accursed mouth, the cannon thundered in the south, and with the sound the carols drowned of peace on earth, goodwill to men. It was as if an earthquake rent the hearthstones of a continent, and made forlorn the households born of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And in despair I bowed my head. There is no peace on earth, I said, for hate is strong and mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Then pealed the bells more loud and deep. God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail, with peace on earth, goodwill to men. The tragedy that Longfellow endured in his life was simultaneously very personal and very national. He and his family were impacted by trials and sorrows that seemed at times random, and by sweeping events also that took a nation to war. But Longfellow's poem reminds us that the glad tidings of the angels who appeared to the shepherds near Bethlehem 2,000 years ago were not simply positive thoughts or good wishes for a better future. They were the proclamation of a God who hears the cries of his people, both individually and corporately, that death, despair, and war are coming to an end. The advent of Jesus begins this new era of history in which God will reclaim and restore and reconcile the world. That glorious angel song has implications for Longfellow personally and also for all of human history. The prophet Isaiah foresaw that same implication when he wrote about the coming Messiah. We very commonly recite pieces of this passage in Isaiah 9 during Christmas time in our churches, but we usually pick up the passage a little too late in its writing to see the sheer scope and magnitude behind the angel's declaration of peace on earth. Isaiah wrote, "The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light, and those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. You have multiplied the nation. You have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, as they are glad when they divide the spoil. For the yoke of his burden and the staff for his shoulder. The rod of his oppressor you have broken, as on the day of Midian, that is, the battle against the Midianites that Gideon won. For every boot of the tramping warrior in battle tumult and every garment rolled in blood will be burned as fuel for the fire. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. On the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. When we come into this holiday season, this Advent season, bearing the scars of past pain, or in the midst of some new sorrow, whether we have suffered in private or as a part of a broader national tragedy, Jesus offers us peace. He will right the wrongs. He will carry our burdens. He will remake the world. And like him, we will rise again. We can rest assured in these things, which is why we can rejoice when the angels declare peace on earth and goodwill to men. Next week, we'll take a look at another Christmas carol and how it can help us better understand the story of Jesus' Advent. I would tell you what that carol is, but I'm a little behind this week due to the Thanksgiving holiday. So at the time that I'm recording this, which is actually before Thanksgiving, I don't know what it is yet. So come back next week and find out. Until then, the Lord bless you this week. Happy Thanksgiving, happy Advent, and we'll see you next time.